Welcome to Gatecrashers, a podcast dedicated to kicking open the door to your next favorite thing. Our mission, our creed, our code is this: to make all things more approachable and accessible to everyone. We want you to find a universe that you'll fall in love with. I am RJ Durante. I use the pronouns he, him, and I will be your host for this interview. I am privileged to have joining with me today author Stacey Kade. You may recall some of her works, including Finding Felicity, For This Life Only, Bitter Pill, and the Project Paper Doll series. We now find her under the nom de plume S.A. Barnes for her spine-tingling space horror novel, Dead Silence. When she is not writing and is able to finally remove her literary mask and cape, she works in a high school library, molding the minds of future readers. Again, please welcome Stacey Kade. Stacey, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So before this, Stacey and I kind of got into, this was my first book of 2022, Dead Silence. Absolutely loved it. But before we even dive into that, we go to our Gatecrashers ultimate question, which is, what is your favorite sandwich?
Right now, my favorite sandwich is a grilled cheese, but it has to be grilled cheese with real melted butter, and it has to be real cheese, not that American oily cheese stuff. No. It has to be real cheese, and it needs to have pickles, not in the sandwich, because that would be gross to me. I don't like warm pickles, but on top of the sandwich. That is my favorite sandwich at the moment.
That is a sandwich. I will say the grilled cheese is it's a great utility sandwich. Just because the combinations of cheeses, obviously, you can do sweet grilled cheese, you can do savory grilled cheese, or you can just do, like you said, a lot of butter and just a really nice cheese. So yeah, I'm on board with that. Very much so on board with that. And also warm pickles, yuck.
Right?
So yeah, no, absolutely. So as an author, what was your inspiration to write this specific novel? Like, is there anything book-wise, film-wise, possibly another author that kind of inspired you to create this specific work?
So I think that ideas sort of show up and you don't always know sort of their lineage, where they come from, how they show up, how things kind of come together. And in this particular case, I have always been fascinated with the Titanic. I remember I'm old enough to remember when they found the Titanic and the National Geographic cover when Robert Ballard found the wreck. And like, that fascinated me. And I think that's always been sort of one of those things that I've secretly harbored an interest in. Is not that not that in the book, the Aurora is a wreck in that same way, but just that idea of when they were able to go down there and you see teacups on the sea floor, or you see, the bath, you used to be able to see the bathtub still in the captain's quarters. That's not possible anymore because the ship is deteriorating. But so I think that was certainly part of this, that idea of being able to explore, which, by the way, you would never, ever get me in one of those like little rover things that go into the bottom of the ocean. No, I am massively claustrophobic. It would never happen. So I had to write myself into it, which is the case for a lot of the things that I love. It's like, no way am I doing that. I'll just make it up instead. The other part of it is, of course, which you actually picked up on, I think, based on part of the conversation we're going to talk about later, which is Aliens, the second movie in the franchise. That was definitely an inspiration, especially as far as Claire, the main character, goes, and her role in the story, and her role as being the person who is not believed.
And yeah, so definitely the Titanic vibes, obviously. I thought you were going in the route when you said I was old enough, and I was like, not to be on the Titanic. And
no! Well, I do like to think that I look okay for my age, but I would be dead, I think, at this point. I think the last Titanic survivor was like an infant and died in her 90s or something, but not that long ago, really. Yeah. So
we'd like to wish Stacey a happy 30th birthday. So thank you for coming on today. We appreciate that. But no, absolutely. And it definitely had a Titanic feel to it, kind of working into the novel, in the sense that you have these frozen moments in time. And, especially going down when Ballard did find it, because myself, it's not that I enjoy wreckage. It's just, I like to see that moment. You see that moment caught, and you're like, yes. What were the moments before this? What led to this? What is that? And like you said, we will kind of get into that briefly. you've kind of, YA romance, YA mystery, suspense a little bit. Was there a hesitancy for you specifically? Because you're switching from the YA genre, you have a very kind of niche market. You know this audience. Now you're flipping over to horror, and horror there are definitive horror fans. There are people who might dip their foot in the water if it's a not too scary for them. But then there are people who just completely avoid it. But the same can be said for YA. So was there hesitancy? Were you all on board?
So I've been a horror fan to some extent my whole life. My parents loved to tell the story. When I was a kid, we lived in a very small town that had a very small children's section. And I read through the entire children's section. Like literally the librarian would call and say, we got new books if Stacey wants to come in. Like this is how small this town was and how small that section was. And I had to get permission to go into the adult section. Mm-hmm. Back then. I don't know if that's still the case. And of course, I immediately started checking out the things I was interested in, which is, Stephen King and Dean Koontz and stuff like that. And my parents, my parents' rule of thumb was you can read whatever you want, but and come to us if you have questions, but don't wake us up in the middle of the night. So I knew that if I woke them up in the middle of the night, that privilege would be taken away. So I would sleep with the lights on, but I did not wake them up. So horror has been a part of my life to an extent. I'm not a big gory person like that. I don't like, so I know that exactly what you meant when there are subsections within that audience. But I will confess to you that when I sat down to write this book, I did not think that I was writing a horror novel. I thought I was writing a sci-fi thriller. That was really my intent. And then as I got into it and I knew I hoped there were some scary moments.
Yes.
And thank you. And I had fun with it because, when you're not the one being scared, it's like, yay, glee, what can I do? Turned it in. I turned the first, I think it was 70 or 80 pages. Right when they get on board the ship and make the discovery. I'm being very vague intentionally. And my agent was like, okay, so first of all, you need to write more of this. And second of all, this is scary and it's horror, by the way. I was like, okay. So I didn't know. And so I didn't really have hesitation about that. And also I loved writing for YA. I'm very proud of the work that I did for YA, but also I feel like I had been doing that this was probably 2016, 17 when I started working on this. I've been doing that for 6 or 7 years. And the kind of stories that I like to tell, in that case, it was paranormal and sci-fi, those weren't really taking off. There was a big demand for realistic fiction. There was a big demand for fantasy, which I struggle with as a writer and a reader. So I didn't really fit there anymore as much as I loved writing for that audience. And I was kind of, let's try something different. So that's how I ended up there.
Well, I see that we have a very similar taste in books, and I do appreciate that. This is a lot easier now knowing I have a kindred spirit in that taste, because I agree, when, especially in writing, if it's not a genre that you yourself may be particularly attached to, it's even that more difficult, because if you can't convince yourself to read it, how are you going to convince others to read it?
Exactly. 100%. Yes.
So kind of branching off to that, do you, how was this different? Like, what was the writing process itself different? Writing horror did you kind of have to approach it differently? What was your method here?
This was harder for me, I think, in the sense that, so a friend of mine, Linnea Sinclair, she's my critique partner, and she also writes science fiction. And she talks about writing as, you can have the skills, but every book writes differently, right? So just because you know how to ski doesn't mean you've skied this mountain, is something that she says. So that to me is particularly true when so maybe the mountains in YA in terms of, I wrote this kind of YA and I'm going to write this kind of YA, they're similar-ish. Whereas if I was leaving an entire range over there and going to an entirely different range of mountains over here to try something new. And I think, so that part, I think, I was worried about, like, do I sound too young? I had always been told when I was writing YA that I have a young sounding voice. I'm not young, but I have a young sounding authorial voice apparently. And I was worried about that. Like, am I going to come across like, that Claire is 17. You know what I mean? Is this going to come across weirdly because I don't know where my boundaries are in this? And then, in the same way that you're worrying when you're writing YA about, is this too scary? Is this too vulgar? Is this too whatever? On the adult end, is this gory enough? Is this scary enough? Is this adult enough? And those were all thoughts that I had, but mainly I just tried to focus on getting the story out of my head as intact as possible, and then worrying about the sort of intricacies of will this fit what audience later. I just really just wanted to get it out of my head onto the page.
And a credit to you, because it reads definitely as someone who was vested in it. I have found myself reading some horror books, and it kind of feels like halfway through they were like, yeah, I just have to fill these pages, and then it kind of picks back up a little later on. But from beginning to end, it's a direct cohesiveness. You absolutely find your way through it, and obviously there are a lot of surprises and something a little different for everyone. So I commend you on that. But I want to dive into the book itself. I'm dying to talk about this book. I have no one else to talk to about it.
I will happily talk about any portion of it, and we can even have a spoiler section offline if that's what you would like. So
absolutely. So as you mentioned, we have this introduction alien style. In this case, we find Ripley, who has, seen the aliens and know what's going on, and no one believes her. Well, now we have Claire, our protagonist, trying to explain the events to a corporation with the cuddliness of Amazon about the fate and crew of the ghost ship Aurora. Now we start getting into a very non-linear storytelling. We're bouncing back and forth, not going to give too much away, obviously, between, we'll say, the past and the present. Mm-hmm. And Claire is very much a unreliable narrator, because obviously she herself is not sure what she is seeing, what has happened, or what's going on. So you start writing this, and you say to yourself, I have to do it this way. It only makes sense doing this way. You're going back and forth, back and forth. Did you find yourself, especially in this unique writing style, did this work better than some of your other stories because you were able to kind of make it a little more scary? Because, when you have an unreliable narrator in horror, you're just as scared as they are.
That's a great way of putting it. And that is exactly what I wanted and why I made some of the choices that I did. I have to admit, I think I probably am termed what's considered an intuitive writer. In other words, I don't really plan anything. I have a vague idea of where we're going and some things I want to hit along the way, but I don't have a map really. So all I knew at the beginning of this, and I don't think this is a spoiler since you find it out in chapter 1, is that she would be in what is the equivalent of a mental institution, essentially, or rehab. Mm-hmm. And I knew I wanted that, which meant, I suppose technically the adventure could have started from that point, and I may have even toyed with that idea, but I loved that sense of, I don't know what happened, and and I'm haunted by what I may or may not have done. And, eventually that's going to come calling. And I didn't know if it would work. In fact, I sent it to a couple writing friends, and they're like, this reads like a sequel, like the beginning did. It reads like a sequel because, we're talking about what happened in the past book, and now we're going to go into some adventure. And I'm like, no, but we're not. We're going to actually go revisit what actually happened. And it's a technique called framing chapters, and I'm not really sure that I did it literally exactly the way framing chapters are supposed to happen. Mm-hmm. But important to me because I feel like I connect better with characters as a reader and probably as a writer as well, that have history, that have really deep history, right? So you're dropped off in the middle of this, in this facility with Claire, and stuff is going, something's wrong with her, even if you're not exactly sure what's wrong. And, she's in trouble. And exactly as you said, I really wanted to pull people we're going to get on board, and we don't know what's going on with her. And we're in it for this ride, just like she is. And that is exactly what I wanted to do. And that was, I guess, the best way I felt to do it, or the only way I knew how to do it. That's probably more accurate. The only way I knew how to do it. And maybe there is a better way, but I couldn't find it. So
Well, you've kind of created a Kade-esque style, we will say, as you've made your own literary move here. This is that first chapter. It completely rewrites every, how-to on writing that has ever been written. And now we're just going to follow that because it is a template that works. It definitely is a template that works because it is familiar yet unique. It kind of creates uneasiness from the get-go. Because of the way, again, I'm trying to tiptoe around certain things, because of the way that the events are introduced. you yourself are like, is this the end? Like, am I getting the end of the book like right at the beginning? Like, what is this? What is this? But trust me, future readers, you will see that it definitely develops into something in this very Kade-esque style. So
I like that. I hope that gets added to a Wikipedia page on literature somewhere. That would be amazing.
I feel like Wiki is open enough that if someone, if this S.A. Barnes character ever shows up and, just maybe puts an entry themselves, then, it might appear.
That could be.
That could be. So obviously, kind of still continue on with the unreliable narrator. Is it something that you saw especially to kind of build up this tension for your readers, kind of make it more so who can I trust? Who is the reliable narrator here? Like, who actually knows the events? Is that something that kind of, as you're writing, you're like, okay, now like this really makes sense. This is, you got everything in mind here. Is that kind of where you were going with that?
I definitely think that it added to what I hoped was the tension in the story, that you don't know who to trust. And so there's this great, I'm trying to remember, I think it's in Christopher Vogler writes The Writer's Journey. And he's the guy who created he took Joseph Campbell. There we go. George Lucas took Joseph Campbell's myth work, and then, Christopher Vogler kind of condensed it and, watered it down depending on who you talk to. But he has this great idea. I'm not saying that, I just know people don't always like his work, even though I found it incredibly helpful. But he points out, there's usually a moment in there where we've identified with the main character, right? And then something happens to them. There's a threat of them being lost. The example he uses is Luke in Star Wars and if you guys need spoiler alert for this, spoiler alert, heaven help me, 40 plus years ago, where they're in the garbage masher and it seems like they're all going to die. Right. And then, and he is like being pulled under by that, monster creature. Thank you. And you're like, and he disappears. And then it's just Han and Leia and Chewie. And it's like, well, now what? Like, who's our hero? Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think in that element, I was trying to do something similar, which is you're on board with Claire, but you're not sure how on board with her you are, right? You're there and we're like, okay, we're going to go along with this because hopefully there are some things that are redeemable about you, but we don't really know. So we're sort of like, kind of loosely attached to you, I hope.
Mm-hmm.
And then as you get in deeper, then maybe you start to see more of why she does what she does and how she does it. But, mainly I did it, I think, and this is a theme that I think is still something I want to explore, is I think the scariest thing is not being able to trust yourself, right? Not being able to trust your own perception, not be able to trust what you deem as reality, because, something we don't often think about as people is that reality is basically agreed upon. It's an agreed upon element. We say that my coffee cup is white because we've all decided that this color is white, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your version of this is the same as mine,
Mm-hmm.
So I think when you get into it, when she's and this is also not a spoiler, she's seeing things that other people don't see. Then all of a sudden it's like, well, wait a minute. I'm not sure if she's really I'm not sure if she's really the character that I should trust. And I think that she doesn't trust herself, which I hope adds to that unbalanced and sort of scary feeling.
I think, the honesty here is at points I was like, come on, Claire, like, what's going on? What are you doing here? And some people will be reading a book and they'll say to themselves, I can't connect with this. This is just, it's too much. Like, I don't know what's going on because they don't know what's going on.
Right.
But especially with something like horror, that uncertainty of trust just builds, and it kind of lends itself back into why you're reading it in the first place, because you want to have that feeling of uncertainty, you want to be scared, and yeah, it plays in really well, especially with the way that it goes and how it ends and everything like that. So yeah, no, definitely in this course, I think that was just an excellent choice, and it actually made it much more enjoyable rather than just one full straight linear. The narrator this is what's happening, And, that's the truth. And it added a lot to it. And it was just a great choice.
I'm so glad. Like I said, I debated it. I mean, so as I've talked about before this book, it took me, I don't know, I think I started this book like 12 times. I mean, I rewrote the opening chapters so many times, more times than I think I've rewritten anything in my life. And this is before, Nightfire was involved. This is just me trying to find my way through the book. There was a version that had, and you will understand this, but listeners will not, that Reed had a point of view chapter at the beginning. I mean, yeah, like he was coming in to talk to her and we're getting his perspective of going into the tower and blah, blah, blah. And of course that is not what worked. And that was not, but it was an interesting exploration because you can see I'm like, kind of like, it's like, I kind of envision it like, you're like, there's a gem or something and you're kind of going knocking, like trying to find the flaw in the gem to find your way in, you're trying to see all the different facets and the different ways this could be shaped. And yeah, so starting that one was really tough and I doubted myself in terms of the two different timelines. And so I'm really glad that it worked. Cause that was not an easy beginning.
So, Claire herself being a very unique character, what other aspect of this did you find like the most difficulty was it building the rest of the characters? Was it creating a plot, the ending? So Stephen King is infamous for having his endings, or as he liked to say, is sometimes I just finish a book, and that's and that's kind of it. And especially horror, there's so many overused tropes. There's so many things, the final girl and kind of like, having like these. How did you navigate that? Like, how were you able to say to yourself, yeah, this is difficult, but this choice works? Like what I guess was the difficulty for you throughout this?
I think you're giving me a lot of credit in sitting down and saying that I looked at something and said, yeah, this works. I really with anything, I always sit down and basically my first job before I worry about anybody else is it entertaining me? Is this keeping me entertained? Because if it's not keeping me entertained, if it's not keeping me interested, then the odds that it's going to entertain someone else are very slim. And in terms of avoiding overused tropes or whatever, I think, if I'm annoyed by it, then I avoided it. That is really as simple as that. One of my favorite things is I love tropes and I love finding a new way into them. I love tilting them a little bit so that it's familiar, but oh no, wait, we did something different here. You know what I mean? That to me is interesting. So I always try to do that whenever I'm working on something, because I don't think there's anything wrong with tropes or even frequent tropes or overused tropes, as long as you can find something new to explore with them. The difficult part with this book, well, there were a couple things. I love science fiction. I'm a big science fiction person. I was terrified to write sci-fi in space because I don't. Unlike a lot of sci-fi writers, I don't have a science background. So a lot of research, a lot of consulting people, a lot of asking, how does this work? I've never been in zero gravity. I have never been on a spaceship. And I always joke, I'm not going until they look like the Enterprise, because no. So no, I'm not doing that. So, I had Linnea, I've referenced her before. She, told me that when she writes ships, she has used her experience on like cruise ships as an example. So as it happened, when I was in the middle of writing this book, I got to take a cruise. My in-laws were very generous and took us along with them. And so I was on a cruise for the first time. And I was like, okay, now I can kind of see how all these pieces, fit together and how this might look for something like that. So that was just like being a consumer of something doesn't necessarily make you, or I felt didn't necessarily make me educated enough to put forth. So I was really worried about that. And I struggled with, how does this ship look? How does the line look? How does this world work? Because to me, the story is always more interesting. And then I got to figure out I'm backwards. A lot of people world build first. I go, this is the story I want to tell. How does all this go? How do I make all these pieces fit? So yeah, that was probably the hardest part.
Well, I mean, the credit there, and I'll give you kind of just a little piece here. When they were writing Star Trek, way back when in the 60s. And of course, it's a team of writers, and they start, being like, oh, they're getting thrown around and they're jumping to, this ridiculous speed and everything like that. And somebody walks in and is like, well, what about inertia? And they're like, what about it? They're like, well, you when you're going a certain speed anywhere, like obviously, people are going to be like crushed against walls and stuff like that. And And that's why I think like the second episode, they're like, turn on the inertia dampers. And that's it. That's the throwaway. That is the throwaway right there. So,
that's amazing. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. I'd never heard that story before. I love that. Oh my gosh.
So, even people who not necessarily have a science background, like it's finding that little way in and finding that, and credit to you for, taking advice and being like, yeah, this can work and this can't work. And, reaching out, and because some people will just kind of push through and be like, oh, if you could suspend belief for this, you'll suspend it for everything else. So definitely in this avenue, I think everything worked. Everything really did work. But this was one of my bigger questions. So I found that the heart of the book is about evil, specifically like the evil of man. Was there anything event-wise or specifically kind of in the real world, because obviously we all have things that happen or something we've seen or done that constitute how we feel? A lot of Stephen King's work is influenced about his own fears and everything from The Shining of imagining raising his son in certain avenues and the fear of fatherhood. But for you, was there anything specifically that kind of made Dead Silence have more weight, especially leading to the evil of the world that it is today, or the evil that just kind of surrounds us, unfortunately?
That is a fantastic question. I think so. There's a couple things I want to touch on. There is a book that I have referenced. Save the Cat is a book it's actually about screenwriting, and it was by Blake Snyder. He's passed away. Jessica Brody has written a version of that for novels, and I found it really interesting that she talks about in horror novels that it involves a sin that having this sin involved in the life of the main character or main characters is what sort of allows the horror in. I do think that's where we get, which is a trope that I wished would die, the idea that women are not allowed to have sex in a movie without being killed by whatever monster is chasing them. But let's not go there. But I did like that idea because I thought, am I wrong? I'm not wrong. I'm
You're not wrong.
Because I think that's really frustrating. But
more sex and horror. That is the bumper sticker by Stacey right now. We're getting there.
If I could figure out a way, like I'm toying with a horror comedy idea, that I would totally do that. It'd be like this somebody who, because I think in general, no, we're totally going the other direction, but I think in general, the idea of women in that way, women's pleasure, women's sexuality is always sort of condemned. You know what I mean? And in horror, it's just, they're not even making any, they're not making an attempt to hide it. If you have sex in a horror movie, you're going to die. You know what I mean? It's not sort of like
that's rule number one. That's number one right at the top.
Exactly.
How dare you?
So I would love to explore that at some point. But anyway, the sin idea, I really was intrigued. I grew up without a lot of money. My dad's a pastor. My mom is a teacher. Money was tight. Being a working writer, money is tight. And so this idea, I think, well, two things with Claire, the idea of not having to worry about money and what that costs you, and, what you'd be willing to do for that money, what amount of money, what you would sacrifice, because there is a viewpoint, which again, I'm trying to be careful, where everything that happens to Claire and her crew is her responsibility because she made the decisions she made. And also this idea of her self-worth is tied into what she does, and she can't figure out another way to find identity or self-worth. And so she drags all these people with her because she's not ready to leave that behind. So I was really intrigued by that because I feel like, but I prefer not to use the word sin so much as just a vulnerability. I mean, these are just vulnerabilities that people have, and, for good or for evil, I suppose. And, we make decisions based on those things. And sometimes our vulnerabilities make us extra vulnerable than to other stuff, I guess. But in terms of the real world, I would say that I have a cynical view of corporations in general, based on having worked for them for, 12 years. I worked as a copywriter in corporate America for several large companies that are not a secret.
God bless you.
Right. And I think that it was it was a very disheartening experience in some ways, because the people that worked there were lovely. And I want to be clear about that. It was never that. It was more the standpoint of, how can we still get your money and give you the least amount of value? You know, that attitude. And I understand it. I understand that's part of a corporation. I'm not suggesting they should be a philanthropic organization, but it's a very hard way to work. It's very hard to, praise this product and then take it to legal and have them say, you can't say that because we won't, it really opens your eyes to things. I worked for an insurance company, and an insurance company would then, make, I'm trying to think of how to say this without revealing too much. In certain states, they would create like sub companies that you would be insured through, so that if, a disaster hit, that sub company would go bankrupt, and then they wouldn't pay out any more claims. That would just be it. And it's like, well, then, screw all the other people, and it's just I understand that's how insurance company works. Please don't cancel my health insurance. I just, I get it, but also like, it's capitalism. And again, raised as a pastor's kid, raised, in that view, I just also feel like we lose the humanity in there sometimes, So I feel like that's where the evil thread in that comes from, when we start focusing. I do not think capitalism in itself is bad, but when we lose focus on our humanity, why I sound like my dad. Sorry, Dad. When we lose focus on our humanity, I feel like that's where we're prone to things. I think of like Paul Reiser's character in Aliens, right? Which was some brilliant casting, by the way. Can you imagine? I mean, I think I'm trying to remember when I saw it. I knew him from Mad About You.
Yeah.
So I don't, but I think it was before that show actually started.
We're talking 12 years prior to Mad About You. No, not. But, Mad About You was 94, I think 92, and Alien was 78, 79. So Aliens was 1983, I want to say.
Okay, and I feel like wasn't he also on My Two Dads? I feel like he was on some sitcom-y.
Yes, he
something.
He was a schwarmy, lovable dad or something. He was this beautiful trope, and then the worst person imaginable.
Gosh, it was amazing. It was because I do remember that the first time, because you're like, oh, Paul Reiser, you're kind of sketched out because he's like really pushing, and you're like, well, maybe he's got good intentions, I don't know. Mm-hmm. And people, if you ask somebody who hasn't necessarily thought about it as stupidly in depth as I have, they would say to you, the bad guys in Aliens are the aliens. But my argument is, they were just
Weyland-Yutani is the bad people in Aliens.
Right? Yes. And specifically Paul Reiser's character, because, and it was just brilliant casting, because you're like, oh, I can't. Oh my gosh, it's Paul Reiser. I felt like that. Oh, there was something that I watched. I know what it was. When Scandal first came out, the Shonda Rhimes television show, the president was the bad guy from Ghost, the Patrick Swayze movie.
Oh my God, that's right.
I cannot see him as a love interest. He's a creep and a possible rapist. No. And it was. So I have trouble separating reality sometimes, whatever. So that was like my whole corporations are evil, and they're all going to I don't know, leave us behind when they go to Mars or whatever. I don't know.
I think it's funny because I have a couple of notes here when I was writing our interview questions, and obviously I had like Paul Reiser in bold. And I think too, it's kind of like it's someone. I had introduced Aliens to someone. They had never seen it. They saw the first one, and obviously the first one and the second one are completely different. I know this is completely off topic to what we're talking about now.
That's okay.
And they had no idea who Paul Reiser was, and his first question was, "Why is the corporation sending somebody with them?" And I had watched that film so many times, and not a moment I was like, "I don't know." He's like, "That's weird. Something's going on here." I was like, well, you got to watch the rest of the movie. And like, after he watched it, he's like, I knew it. And I was like, I know you did. I heard you. And I just never thought of it that way. And I think, spoiler free, we're just going to say that this book definitely kind of, epitomizes just evils in general. And I think, we have this moment of greed. And obviously there's definitely some components there, but overall, I think it's the most horrific thing is just how far things can go over, some dollars and cents. But beyond that, we'll just say that, yeah, corporate America, you're doing wonders for everybody right now. So thank you for that, I guess.
Right. Well,
Right.
I feel like there should be a term for that, by the way, because, because your friend didn't know Paul Reiser. Like, I feel like the rest of us who did, we got Paul Reisered. You know what I mean? And like, like that should be a term. And I feel like the other one this is totally off topic, but now that you've got my brain spinning on this, I can't stop. Knives Out, casting Chris Evans as Ransom. Captain
Damn America.
Right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So yeah, see, Paul Reiser. They totally Paul Reisered us.
And if we're going way back when, Henry Fonda in the film Once Upon a Time in the West plays this straight up villain. When Henry Fonda was Grapes of Wrath, he was, the epitome of a Steinbeck cultural novel. And then years later is like the nastiest villain on the face of the earth. So it's crazy. It'd be if Paul Rudd comes out and you're like, oh, it's Paul Rudd, and then he just like kicks a kid or something like that, and the rest of the film, you're like, come on, Paul, what's going on here?
There was some sci-fi movie, I think, where he was the bad guy. I'm not even sure I was able to finish watching it because it was so disorienting. Disorienting. So I don't know, but yes, yeah, I think I have like trauma from working in corporations, and it definitely shows itself.
Well, if we're going to branch off anything, we'll branch off our discussion of films. So Adaptations. This is definitely and I'm going to speak off the cuff here, a very easy adaptation to do. I think it's written so well, and it was, I consider a good book, one that I could kind of watch as a film as I'm reading. So definitely something that I could see on the big screen or the little screen or graphic novel, webtoon, something. In your mind, in your perfect world, we're going into perfect world here, so we're not here right now. Where is it going? Is it a film? Is it a TV show? What, is it a mini series? What are you thinking?
Oh boy, scale wise, everybody would always like a movie, of course, like that's the dream, right? But I also feel like I'm loving what they're doing lately with limited series streaming. So, where you've got 5 or 6 episodes that tell the whole story. I feel like that would be amazing because, I'm thinking like the first episode, where we're in that first chapter where Claire is at the tower, the rehabilitation center, and, they're coming to talk to her, and we're just, getting little snippets of things, and then that would lead to the next. It wouldn't even necessarily have to be long episodes. I just think it would be a really fun way to do it. But I don't know the practicalities of it. Obviously, again, we're in perfect world, so budget might not be an issue. Who knows? But, you have a lot of special effects when you're dealing with spaceships, and we have multiple spaceships in this.
That's all CGI, and that's nothing. There's no money there.
Well, it was really funny because, I always feel like this is, I appreciate you saying that you could see it being a movie or a film of, some type of different medium. Because that's what happens in my head. I see it like that, and I'm trying to write as frantically as possible to try to make it match what's in my head. And I felt like I could see this one very clearly, relatively. But, I also know that, when you're working on something like this, it's a cool thing. I always say like, oh, I'm the executive producer, I'm the director, I'm the writer, I'm the casting agent, I'm the, I'm everything, and I don't have to worry about a budget. So, I want to make this blow up. No problem. Boom, it's gone. So that's kind of one of the awesome things about books is you are not limited. I can cast anybody I want, even if they're currently age inappropriate in terms of being too old for a role, like whatever, who cares?
I think Paul Reiser's available, and I know exactly who he would play. And I think it would be true to form. But funny enough, I think he was just in the 3rd season of Stranger Things, and he was he completely redeemed himself from the 80s, because the entire season I was like, what are you up to, Paul Reiser? What are you up to? So yeah.
Well, I always feel like that too. It's really funny to me watching Stranger Things because I guess I'm blanking on the name of the brothers who work on that, but I feel like they must be similar, either similar in age to me or similar in terms of like cultural things, because I see things. I've actually had people email me and say, are you mad about this? Because, they stole your idea for Project the Paper Doll Project. And I'm like, no, we just read a lot of Stephen King. All of us read a lot of Stephen King and were influenced by it. So I like that they got to Paul Reiser, but that is an excellent idea. And should I ever be in a position to offer casting suggestions, I'm going to do that.
The Duffer Brothers. It literally came to me as you were. But yeah, no, funny enough, yes, Stephen King is actually, you're on the nose there. And even Stephen King will say he was talking to Variety or something like that and saying, he's like, I see my work everywhere. He's like, and I'm not mad. Because he's like, he goes on to say, he's like, everyone has the same nightmares. He's like, whether you think it or not, everybody has the same nightmares. He's like, so it's just we all of our minds branch the same way. He's like, so is it really my writing, or is it just, everybody's just feeling the same thing?
He's really good at tapping into those. Well, he's really good at tapping into those fears. I mean, I have to be careful how I say this. There's a scene in a cabin, in one of the cabins on the ship. You will know what scene I'm talking about. Yeah. That I basically was like, well, that's a childhood fear knocked out right there. Okay. And I was like, everyone I know is like, well, I can't, I can't have to stop there because I'm going to spoil it. But yes, I definitely tried to think like, what are the things that scare me and have continued to scare me. And yeah, so I get what he's saying. And I love that idea that we all have the same fears, because I think that's, yeah. I think it's the same nightmares. I think that's a really good point. I had not heard that before.
So as pretty much we're just doing a Stephen King love fest right now. What is your scary novel? What is you sat down and it was a book, and not even just scary, maybe just unsettling, or, there's books that are like, oh, and then there's books that like at the end, they're like, what did I just read? Like that really is going to mess me up for a couple of days.
So it is a Stephen King novel. Shocking, I'm sure. And remember, I told you I started reading them when I was pretty young. Like a lot of us who are big readers, we tend to find stuff at an earlier age. And there's a 13-year age gap between me and my youngest sibling, a sister. And so she was probably about, I'm going to say 3 or 4. And I had discovered Pet Sematary. And yeah, that face. Yes, exactly. And I was fine. I was reading it. I was fine. And then I don't know, I was playing with her or something. And I just like suddenly like really hit me. And I was like, nope. I noped out of that. I couldn't I still to this day, I've never finished Pet Sematary. I can't do it. And actually what's really funny is when I was a kid, when I was 12, 13, 14, I think I was fairly fearless aside from leaving the lights on or whatever. I have a hard time for being a horror writer and somebody who loves horror. I have to be really careful about when I watch things, when I read things. I get scared. When I was writing this book, I had constant dreams of being chased like by zombies. It was usually zombies, which there are no zombies in this book. That's just not a thing. And yeah, horrible nightmares. So I think I'm like really susceptible to stuff like that. So yeah, so Pet Sematary, and I don't get along.
I think it's funny because when my son was born, that's when I decided to pick up Pet Sematary, because I was moving through. Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking. I was moving through his collection as well, and you think of something. The Shining's always a good go-to. But I think I look at something like Salem's Lot, and spoiler alert for those who haven't read it, too bad. There's a moment about halfway through when God, is her name Susan? I literally just read this, but we'll say the protagonist's girlfriend at the time falls prey to the vampire and becomes a vampire. And I had not read a book where the love interest was just cast aside so laissez-faire, and just I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked. And that was unsettling for me because it was literally no one's safe. And that was one of the first books where it was really no one is safe. And credit to King there. But I think in your book, no spoilers, definitely is a, who's safe? What is safe? Mm-hmm. So, it kind of harkens back there. But it's interesting too, especially with where your book starts, where it leads to. And I would say it definitely took unexpected turns, which I'm sure you're very happy to hear.
Yes.
But ultimately, I will say that, the greatest strength of the book itself was it was just a damn interesting book. And it was one that I absolutely, I started, and it was one of those, I've read enough for today. Let me put it aside. And I was like, yeah, I could probably get a couple more, pages in. And so that is my praise there, because I do not have the mind for that. I am very much I have 20 other things that I could be doing, and, but this book held my attention. So thank you for writing it. I enjoyed reading it. So my big question to you is, what's next? What is, are we working on something right now? What's going on?
First, thank you for that. That is awesome to hear, because one of the things that I liked about when I heard your description of this podcast is that you're trying to make things more accessible to people, more interesting to people who may not find it. And that was really my hope for this book. So I'm glad that someone who is a horror fan found it interesting, because I'm also really hoping that people who, and I'll be directly honest, is people, women especially, who are sort of not afraid of, that's the wrong word, feel that sci-fi is not for them, or feel that horror is not for them. I'm hoping they'll give this a chance with a, female lead character. And I appreciate, so that's kind of like one of my mission tied in my head, is I want to make the stories that I love, I want more people to find them. So I appreciate all that you said, because I also don't want the horror people to run away. What's next? So that is an excellent question. I don't know. I have two horror ideas that I'm really, really excited about. And one of them is space horror. And I am in that, well, actually I should say it's sci-fi horror. In that vein where can I actually pull this off? I don't know if I can pull this off, which is both a good place and a bad place to be. And then I have another one that is more, I would call it, I guess, just straightforward horror, because I really feel like there's something to be said about the awfulness of middle school girls and what it's like to be one. And I feel like I don't want to talk too much about it. But I feel like that, well, because it's very exciting and I'm like super excited about it, but please. I also don't want to, but I feel like there's a perception that, girls, because we're told to be nice, we're told not to be angry, whatever. And I feel like there's a lot of pent up rage that I think would be really interesting to explore, especially at that age. And then what happens when you do something terrible when you're 13, 14, and how do you live with the consequences, for the rest of your life? Are you watching, or have you watched Yellow Jackets? I have not. It is on we're going into year 3 of the pandemic, and I feel like eventually I'll come around to it, probably around year 6 or 7. But it's definitely on my list. Netflix is going to come up and go, dude, there's nothing left. You've been here.
We're done. The catalog is over. It
is really good. It is really good. And it's kind of operates, those are high school age girls, so slightly older. And, but it is fantastic. And I mean, literally it's focused on the friendships and the animosity that occurs and both as teenage girls and then as adult women dealing with these secrets and stuff. And it is fantastic. So it's kind of like that, I wrote this thing first and then I saw this and went, yeah, like that. And then I don't know. The other one, the sci-fi horror one, is kind of that idea again of what is it, how does your history impact your present, and what does it mean when you are questioning reality again? So I really like that theme. I'm going to probably keep going back to that well until I get tired of it. I don't know. Or until you guys all get tired of it. One of the two.
As long as if it works, it works. I mean, there's no point shying away from it. And it harkening on Yellow Jackets, it made me think of I can't even think who talked about it, but someone was asked, what's one of his favorite horror novels, and he said Lord of the Flies. And they were like, that's a unique choice. And he said, it really speaks to the depravity of, when we're in a situation that we're not familiar with and we create our own social hierarchy with no rules except for the ones that we create and stuff like that. And he says that, it's more intuitive because it's been forever since I read the book. And from my recollection, it's all males. I believe it was and because it had to be because his next step was, now what if the book was written about all girls stuck? He said, would that be a scarier novel or would that be less scary? He's like, and we'll never know. And it just made me think of this idea of, like what kind of, I agree, middle school girls are terrifying, as
Yes.
as a former middle school boy and as someone who not that I'm roaming around the halls of middle school right now, but I do know I have a sister who is 18, and I remember, I'm lucky enough, she was in middle school only 5-6 years ago, and how she acted and how her friends acted was horrifying. And just how usually, and we're not getting into a gender-based debate here in terms of, boys actions versus girls actions, but just the stuff that was texted, because again, the evolution of phones and like Snapchat and Instagram, and I was like, damn, like I'm thin-skinned apparently, and coming from my time, and I was just like, wow, that's a whole nother level. So yeah, middle school girls are terrifying. I will
Yes.
I will definitely concede that. And as a someone who works in a library, I know some of the more fun, because all the fun stuff happens in the library.
Yes, it does. I had to tell you, I did not know that until I went to go work I had worked in a public library before, which is a very different experience. You guys can't make out in this corner. Please stop doing that. Please stop doing that. Don't punch him. I don't care if you're play punching him. You can't do that in here, and stuff like, don't dump your water bottle. I mean, there's all this stuff and that's in between, of course. And I'm joking, of course, because that stuff does happen. Once found a live goldfish in a plastic bag. That's a whole other story. That kind of stuff happens, but I really do love it because I am in a position to help kids find books and hopefully find a love of reading. And I think that's amazing, because I really don't think it's overstating it to say that in many times, made my life tolerable when it was otherwise not, because I could open a book and just kind of drop through that hatch. And I want other people to have that as well. But yes, I am very familiar. Although I will tell you this now, I think that high school is less awful than middle school. And that is saying a lot. So, I mean, that's my perspective. But I feel like, by the time they get to high school, I also feel the kids today are a lot more, the bullying probably takes place more out of sight than it did when I was in school, because we didn't have cell phones. But I do feel like they're more open-minded, and they have experienced a lot more of the world thanks to the internet than we ever did. Than I ever did. I'm 40 something. So, the 90s.
I was literally that last wave of I graduated in high school in 2006. So I was like that. I got my first phone. I was 17, 18, and it was like my father's business had like an extra phone and it found its way to me, type of deal. But yeah, so definitely I was completely out of that realm as well. And I think it's a great place to find your inspiration for our novels. So I will definitely say that. But more so on a more positive note, I like to think, opening a book is your first great adventure. And I think it's definitely something that we talk about, especially in society today, how our literacy rates have not gone up, but gone down. And, where we are in an education standpoint across the world. And, just it takes someone just stepping in and being like, hey, here's a book. Hey, this is a great read. So that is our goal here at Gatecrashers, finding something accessible to beginner readers, everything up to someone who wants to read War and Peace for fun, which is amazing. No offense.
No, I have kids who check it out at least once a semester. I do.
Wow.
They decide to try it, not because a teacher told them to, but because they hear it's impossible, and so they come and they try it, and that's amazing. I'm always like, let me know how it is, because I haven't read it, but I mean, to your point, I think the biggest thing is the thing that I try to get across. And I love the idea of this podcast, which is that, there's a book for everybody. You just have to you have to find that book. Everybody can be a reader. And I will also say this, one of the things that I found most heartening in working in a high school is everyone's, kids are always on their phone, and they are on their phones a lot, just like adults. But they prefer paper. I will see kids reading books, like actual physical books, on a daily basis, and multiple of them. And I think that is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I'm so proud to play any small role in that.
All right. Before we go into our interlude here, I want to give you an opportunity. What are you reading right now? Who are you reading right now? Any recommendations?
Oh gosh. Well, right now what I'm reading is The Maid, and I think it's Nita Prose. I'm not sure if that's the right last name, but it's got the red cover, which is it's a mystery / thriller with, I think, what I would term, and I'm not sure this is the right term, a neurodivergent point of view character, which is very interesting. I have read my favorite recently. I read Widow by Alma Katsu. She's known for horror. I'm sure you have read her or know her. But this is actually based on her background in the CIA, and it is so flippin' cool. It's just so neat. It's like getting to tag along with Dana Scully at the FBI, even though it's the CIA. But you know what I mean? Like, it's just neat. Mm-hmm. You're definitely getting like the inside. What is that called? Like inside baseball or whatever that sports saying is. Not a sports person. And it's really neat. My other one that I love, which is more in the horror vein, and I seriously hope that there's going to be another one, is The Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. I love ghost stories, and this is both, and I'm not a fantasy person, but this has magic in it, but it's magic in the real world, which is I'm okay with. The concept of that one is Yale, and she's, I believe, a Yale alum. Has all these secret societies, and everybody knows about them, like, what is it, Skull and Bones or whatever. Please, by the way, secret societies, don't send people to my door. I don't know anything about you. They, in this case, like create like these black magic rituals in order to run the world secretly. So, and the main character is brought in because she can see ghosts without having to perform ritual. She can just see them. And it is an amazing book, and I need the next one. So I hope it's coming.
Shout out to my wife here for telling me about that book as well, and her love for Leigh Bardugo. So I'm glad to see that Leigh Bardugo is doing well and just grasping everybody out there. I know I'm eventually going to have to read that book if I hear the plot one more time.
Okay, your wife has awesome taste. So
she does.
And you should definitely read it, because it is so good. It's just so good. And I won't say any more because I don't want to spoil it, because you're definitely going to need to read it.
So as we close out here, I just want to thank everyone for listening. Thank you to Stacey Kade for joining us on this wonderful podcast here at Gatecrashers. You can find her on Twitter at Stacey Kade. That is Stacey with an EY. The only way to spell it. And you can and you can find myself on Twitter as well at ArgRJ, because I did not think about this when I had to spell it out. That is at Arg, ARGHRJ. This has been a wonderful interview. Thank you very much. And we're going to close out here. Stacey, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.
You're welcome. Tune in next time. This has been Gatecrashers. The Gatecrashers.